Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on and having a chat, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin, or reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin at faucedon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm really looking forward to my conversation. We were having a great chat right before we got started, and let's just get into it. So today, my guest is Chris O'Dell. Chris, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
I'm Chris O'Dell. I'm a software engineer. What else should I say, Isaac? What's interesting?
I mean, that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
You're a software engineer. You ship code for a living, which is always an exciting thing to do. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation for a lot of reasons. And I think one of the ways I'd love to get started is kind of talking about origin stories. You know, like I think a lot of folks in tech are superheroes. Like a lot of us do crazy things. You know, do you remember when you first came across technology or computers or anything in that particular area and you're like, oh, this is something that's very interesting. Like maybe I should run with this.
This is going to date me. This is certainly going to put an age pin into me. So I think the first time I really came across computers was my dad was interested in them. My dad was very much interested in the idea of Pascal, the programming language. And sure. He managed to get a Amstrad. I don't know if you remember the Amstrads. They were tape-based computer. So
sure. I've heard, but I've not had the luxury of experiencing one. Yeah.
So he had an Amstrad at home, and you would get tapes to play games, but there was also a feature where you could code your own games in BASIC. And you could get magazines, and he would buy these magazines, and at the back there would be some pages of BASIC you could code in. And I thought that this was fantastic. So there's me as a young person at the time.
Sure.
Basically I discovered that you could make the screen into any kind of color you wanted by typing in a few letters or whatever.
Yeah.
So I spent most of my time making the screen dance and jiggle, and that was fantastic. I had this power that I could do that. So that's the first time I really played with it. Not to know what I was doing, but that was enough to get me interested. So in school, when there was a choice to take a computing class, I took it. Yeah.
That's awesome. So, and if this isn't you, please correct me, but I think your story kind of, it matches up with a lot of, I guess, folks in tech's origin stories, right? Like not the CDs in the mail or any of that. Like that's depending on your generation of getting started, that fits pretty well. But like that tinkerer mentality, like I like being able to move some bits and things change. Like, I think that's something is shared across all technologists. We're curious by nature. And it's very, very interesting to like have that feeling of your direct actions have some effect that actually end up doing something with, like, I mean, let's be real. Like we're tricking like sand to do weird stuff. Right. I love using that phrase because it's so, so I guess, you had some parents that were interested and they kind of helped you along. At what point in time did you realize that, like, I want to actually focus on this? Like, was it in school? Was it after you got out of school?
It was probably in school, to be honest. I discovered later on we got our PC. And that PC came, like you say, CDs. You jogged my mind. The first time I discovered it, the internet was on the CD. That makes no sense. But back then, you installed the internet. And that's what had the modem and the stuff code in it. And I discovered HTML. Back then, it was probably a bunch of tags. And I was tinkering with that. And I discovered that there's this job like webmaster and things. I'm like, you can make a job on a computer. You can have a job doing this stuff, like just typing in stuff and making it do funny colors. So I thought it was absolutely fascinating. So I continued. So I thought, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try and make a job in this. I'm going to see what happens. So I took computing all the way through school. So I did the computing A level, which is age 18, up to age 18 in the UK. And I went to study it in a university as well. So it's a pretty standard route that most people take. But then I was younger and naive and honestly thought I would get into game development.
Sure. When you're a kid, like that's the dream, right? I feel like that is something that is very shared amongst technology folks of a certain age. Like the idea of like, oh, I love playing Mario, or I loved playing Zelda or whatever. Like I want to build these things. And then you find out that like having a career in game development is different than what you would expect.
Yes. That's exactly what happened. I was learning about game developer. I started getting like the industry magazines. I started reading about how it all worked, like launches and the expos and the release dates. And I'm just like, I'm there at 20 going, maybe not.
Yeah. And this isn't to knock any of our friends that are in the game industry, but I can imagine it being very stressful at times. But I imagine also very rewarding knowing that millions of people like are playing like with code that you wrote, which is pretty awesome. So you went through kind of, I guess you could say, the traditional track in technology, like you went to university. And then, so do you remember when you realized that it was something like, I think you mentioned a little bit like the HTML wave of things and being able to build websites. And that's when you realized that you could build a career out of, silly things like that. And and the reason why I ask is I have a side question. And it dates my age because I came up of like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and like MySpace pages were like the thing, right? Where you can customize a MySpace page and have it crash browsers and whatever. Like, did you enjoy that sort of work? Like I know the web stuff back then was interesting because like you had very trivial things that you could do. So I guess my question is did you feel at some particular time that like it was what was challenging for you as a part of it? Because I think what's really important is like we have to feel challenged. Like, did you remember like, oh, like some of this is hard, some of this is easy, some of this I get. I guess I'm trying to figure out like where your interest lies, right, as you went through kind of discovering technology for yourself.
That's an interesting question. So let me think about it. The HTML stuff, like I say, was much simpler back then, and I liked the immediate effect of producing back to the Amstrad thing, producing all the colors on the screen and everything like that. And what I discovered is that you can. I discovered OpenGL and stuff, and I went to university and I learned about graphics programming. Like I say, I wanted to be a games developer at the time. And what did I find challenging? I found challenging the difference there between really simple HTML to really, really complex like OpenGL and C++. But I don't know why I did all that to myself. And maybe because I was younger and I was in university, I suppose the thing I found most difficult to focus on were the things that weren't directly related to making fun things. So the classes around databases, they were not fun to me. The classes around what else is there? The classes around human computer interaction, which is the precursor to user interface design.
Sure.
I did not find that interesting. So I think the challenge was to stay focused enough and all these other bits not to fail my university degree.
Yeah, I tell this story a lot. Like one of the first programming assignments that I got when I was in college was like building an ATM in C. And I'm like, and I remember talking to somebody else in my class and I'm like, why would I ever want to do this in the real world? Because in my world, I was very focused on like, and maybe this is just because of my upbringing, I was very focused on like getting a job, like when I was in college. I think a lot of folks are like that. And I realized pretty quickly that like a lot of the things that I was learning, like I can't take what I'm learning here and directly turn it into a job. So like I was in a computer science curriculum and then I moved over to like a more information systems business sort of degree. Because that directly connected to me is like, okay, like I'm building forms over data or I'm building e-commerce site or stuff like that. Like this is immediately like, I know I can get a job this. I couldn't wrap my head around getting a job like learning Big O notation. Not to knock folks that are great with Big O notation, but like it took me a while to realize like those concepts are integral to like being successful in tech, right?
Yes. I had the exact same journey as yourself.
Yeah.
Like I say, I wanted to focus on the pretty things, the immediate impact of programming something and seeing it react. But yes, all those kind of like theory sides of the classes were just really difficult to pay attention into because they were abstracted away. Same with like database stuff. I had no concept of what a database was when I was in university. The idea of storing millions of rows of data and needing to make them normalize. I'm like, why are we doing this? Like, what is normalizing? Yeah. So it wasn't until I was probably 10 years into my career that I went, I'm going to go back and do all that again. I'm going to study that again. It's making sense more now. And that's actually something I did. I went Coursera. I've got a really nice algorithms course in there, which I sat through both days and did that. And
sometimes I'll do like Leet Code or like some of those coding exercises, and I realize that like my algorithm skills are not very good very, very quickly because I can always solve the problem, but it's always slow. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I mean, I guess then I need to own up on algorithm work, which, I mean, I guess you could say, is there value in it? I guess in some particular cases is for most people, like most part people are just like, I have a database that's normalized. Can you like make a web page for it or an app for it or whatever? But it is interesting, like how if you take that next step in learning like the concepts and the theories, like things start to like make sense in your brain of like, oh, like the reason why I'm using this sort algorithm is because of this, right? Which is always exciting.
Yeah, I think for me it was harder without the practical side first.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And not to knock formal education or how computer science curriculums work, but I think that, if you look at how some people learn now, like with code camps, like that's the complete antithesis of it. It's like, we're going to teach you all the skills needed for you to get a job. Right. And I think a lot of, I guess, traditional learning is like, we're going to teach you everything that you need to, I don't want to say this in a bad way, but like continue in academia. Right. And that's not a bad thing. Like, I think we're always going to need folks that are trying to solve problems. But if I would have been born like 10 years later or 7 or 8 years later, like when code camps were huge, like would I have wanted to go down the traditional education experience? Probably, because I wanted to experience college. But I guess my point is, and this is a question that I have for you, it's like, do you, I guess, look at the classes, and I know it's probably been a while for you, it's been a while for me, like the things that you learned in college, like you can directly correlate them to things that you've done recently? And you can dodge that question if you want. That's totally fine.
Probably not. I think what happened for me in university was I kind of cheated. I had a choice of modules. I had a choice of things I could pick. And I picked the most practical modules I could pick. So I cheated.
That's okay.
I tailored my course away from the theoretical because I realized it was my weak point. So I think
I wouldn't call that cheating, by the way. I would call that being more evolved than a lot of other people at that age, right? Like a lot of people just grind through the classes and then they get burnt out. I think you took the initiative to like, there are things that I enjoy more. Let me focus on those things. Like that's, in my opinion, that's awesome. Like that's substantially a better approach than like, oh, my advisor said I'd take these 6 classes and then whatever, right? Like, that's a way to get really exhausted with the stuff that you're supposed to be passionate about.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of it like that. I thought I was just following whatever was shiny, and I'm glad it got me a job at the end.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with liking things that are shiny. I can tell you that. So when you were going through university and eventually you started in industry, right? You got a job. Like what were some of the things that you immediately were like, oh, like the stuff that I learned here, I can definitely use them to do these things in job? Or was it very much you learned everything like for your work as a part of work? And the reason why I asked that is like a lot of the stuff that I worked on in college directly translated into stuff that I was doing in my first job, which I think I was very lucky in that regard. Like I was building, classic ASP or like .NET framework applications in college. And then I was able to do that same thing in my career first, which was, lucky, because at the end of the day, like I had no other skills. I guess like, same question for you. Like, recall like some of the things that you were immediately able to kind of embed from your learnings in university to what you were doing in school or as part of your job?
I'm going to change the story a little bit because of the way
Sure.
my first job went.
It's your story. You can do whatever you want.
Thank you. So my first job out of university, I applied to a local company that was hiring out of the university, and I applied to be a software engineer there, junior programmer, and but they offered me a job of a junior project manager, and I'm like, 21, it's the dot-com bubble bursting, and I'm thinking I'm going to take whatever job I can get.
Yeah, yeah.
I then later discovered that all of the programmers were men and all the project managers were women. Oh,
interesting. Interesting how that happened.
How
but
that
yeah.
happened. Yeah. So I wouldn't say I basically failed at that. I was terrible at it. The fact that I was a woman did not make me good at it at all. So when you're saying, did I have any transferable skills from the university into my first job? Not really. The only good skill was writing.
Sure.
Really
which is a great skill to have. Don't get me wrong. I'm a terrible writer. So like being able to write is pretty valuable. Yeah. I would like to kind of talk about this a little bit because I think this is interesting because I think the phrase or the role or job project manager, it has a lot of spiciness to it, right? Like it's kind of tied to like a more legacy way of building applications, like more waterfall based approach if you're kind of in the DevOps world. And like now we know that waterfall is very bad. No one should ever do waterfall. It's the worst thing ever, right?
Even waterfall doesn't say to do waterfall.
Yeah, exactly. But like project managers, like, and I remember when I was first getting started and I was a developer, like I liked my project managers, but I always kind of didn't enjoy the conversation because the conversation was always like, what, give us the updates. Where are you at here? Are you going to hit the deadline? Like it was a lot of, I guess, pressure's not the right word, but I'm going to use it. Like it was a lot of pressure to like work harder. Yeah. Was that your experience? Like, I mean, not every project manager is the same. Some of them are great. Some of them, they have tons of opportunities to be a bit better. Like, did you realize very quickly, like, I like computers and I like technology and I'm kind of stepping away from it. I'm kind of more in like management, like project management is very much like management of projects, right? Hence the name. Like it's a bit separate from technology, right?
Yes. I was thinking back on it from way back when it was kind of almost like a BA role back then. Kind of
which is even farther away from technology, right?
Well, I ended up writing, it was a weird separation they had there. I spent most of my time writing specifications for the developers to implement. So it was this weird kind of, but I was also on the hook for ensuring deadlines were met for the customer. So that was the project managing bit. And what I discovered was that that I was just absolutely rubbish at the timescale management stuff. Like the key part of being a project manager is keeping everything on track. And I like had time blindness or something. I was rubbish at it.
I went through your career progression on LinkedIn, before we got started. And like now you're an engineer, but like you've had experiences like doing management type of stuff, program management, product management. And, you don't have to answer this directly. You can skate it. But like, in your opinion, is there skills that correlate to a particular job that you enjoy more? Like, because I think of, a typical product manager or program manager, some of them can be very, very technical and like basically be engineers, right? That write blog posts and things like that. And then others are, I guess, more business oriented, like trying to work more with marketing to craft out business value and things like that. I guess my question is do you see that there are particular skills for each role that you're attracted to or you find yourself more interested in?
I would say I'll say what I'm not interested in. I'm not interested in the more business side of it. I think I had trouble. I've tried it. I've also tried consulting. I think the issues I had there personally was the communication is hard. It is a tough job.
Yeah.
To get that communication right and continually get that communication right between these different silos of people, hopefully not silos, is a challenging role. It's really challenging. And people who can walk that line are amazing. People who
Yes.
can talk to everybody and get agreement and get understanding at every point are amazing. And when I've worked with someone who can do that, it's fantastic. Like everything just works so much more smoothly. So I preferred the specification side of it, the getting the user requirements down in a way that was pretty precise. In fact, I was practically coding, just not in a coding language.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, getting it right down to the details. So it was that preciseness, I think, that I really enjoyed. That's
Yeah. And I think it really depends on where you work too, because some companies there's a expectation, right? They're like, oh, you're going to be a more technical product manager or a technical program manager, and then maybe some jobs or some orgs in different companies are like, no, like we want you to focus on partnering with marketing to sell or onboard or whatever the phrase is, whatever is going to drive your product as much as possible. Right. And I assume that you've worked in kind of both sort of worlds. When as an engineer and you're working with a product manager that is less technical or more technical, and again, spicy question, you don't need to answer it. Do you have a preference?
I think the preference aligns with the product itself. So let me explain. If you are working with a very customer-facing product, I would prefer that more producty, less technical person because they represent the customer better.
Yes.
I feel like they're closer to what we're trying to achieve. They understand them way better than I ever could. And I've done that. That's fantastic. Like when you get a really good product manager who's out there doing a bit of user research, doing a bit of like A/B testing, all that kind of beautiful stuff where they know where they want to take the product. So I'm happier for them to be less technical because they've got that vision. But if you're working on something more internal, if you're working on something that is like a developer platform or the platform team, and believe me, platform teams do need their internal product manager if you've got a big enough company for it. I prefer them to be technical because the product is technical. And the customers are technical. And I know I'm using the word technical here, but I guess I mean more engineering, because every job is technical in a different way. I'd rather them to understand the engineering product that they're working on.
Yeah. I guess the delineation that I always use, and this is not fair to any product manager, but like if asked, could you do a demo? Like if somebody was like, hey, can you demo your product? And if you can demo your product in a really effective way and talk to business folks or technical folks, like that is the skill, right? And I've seen different folks are really good at doing demos. Some folks, demos is not something they're really keen on. But I think one of the things that I've always appreciated when working with product managers is if I was to be like, hey, could you show me this thing that I just built and explain it to me? And it makes sense to me as an outsider, then that's something that I really look to, and I think that's really cool. But again, that's not fair to project managers because that's not their job, right? Like their job isn't to like, okay, can you write some code to do some stuff? Like some product managers are brilliant at that, but I don't think that's a core component of the role, right?
I would agree with you on that. I would say like the role, like I said, is about visioning the product, I would say, and ensuring everyone understands that vision that they're trying to get across.
Yeah.
Really.
So, kind of going back to, a little bit of career progression and different technology interests for you. One of the things that I've always been really interested in, especially in the web space, is that like the web seems to cycle over every few years where something that's really, really popular will show up and everybody wants to use it. And then something that was cool like 5 years ago, rewrapped in another technology will show up and we rinse repeat, right? Like what are some of the themes that you've seen over your career in technology in the web that you're like, oh, like this is never going to go away. It's just going to come back in a different form.
One of those that is pretty key, one of those that you can see quite clearly, I would say, is, let me think, what's the word? is that server client communication. Way back when we had things like the words are gone. WPF, that kind of thing. I don't know if you remember that, but it was like
Windows presentation layer.
All those fat clients and stuff like that. And the communication, web services, that kind of communication. I'm so sorry.
WCF.
Thank you, WCF, not WPF. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's old. And all that.
Soap-based services, yes.
Soap-based stuff where you'd have a fat client on the website, or whoever's reading it, you basically you point your your IDE at the service, and it would generate your client, and then you communicate through that. And it wasn't really readable or understandable. I mean, it was soap, you could open it and have a look at it. And we went away from that. And we found REST. REST was the opposite. It was clear, you could read everything, you had like this communication through that. And then we've gone kind of back the other way again with things like gRPC.
I'm going to keep my opinion of gRPC to myself, but I remember the first time I ever saw gRPC from a .NET standpoint. I very much looked at one of my colleagues and I was like, so this is WCF now? We're doing WCF again? And again, like, it's not the same. I don't want people to think that I think that gRPC is not a good idea. I think it very much is. I even think WCF to an extent is a great idea, depending on what sort of stuff you're building, because now WCF, you can do a .NET Core and all that sort of great stuff. But it is interesting that, like, and I always equate it to like JavaScript frameworks versus, like, do you want to build stuff on the server or build stuff on the front end, right? And there's pros and cons to both. And I think now we're getting into this world where it's like server-side rendering is very important again. And it's like, okay, but you just told me that, like, for the last 5 or 6 years that, like, JavaScript and client-based development is like the way to go, rich user experiences, Web 2.0, all that sort of nonsense. And now you're telling me now it's like, oh, it's bad for SEO. But yeah, we knew that. We knew it was bad for SEO. Like, people have to carry around like megabyte large JavaScript files like to the clients. But that's fine, because you told us that. Like, it's funny now that we're getting back to this world where, and I don't know if you've worked in this technology, but like when you build like web forms applications, and like the idea is like, oh, like all the HTML is sent back to the browser, like all of it. And then the browser just paints it, right? Like we're getting back to that. Like now all these JavaScript frameworks and even like ASP.NET Core Blazor, like, is doing these things with server-side rendering, which is kind of hilarious to me.
That kind of pattern, back and forth. Another pattern that's happening or emerging right now is the micro clash. Everyone's like, don't you want a monolith now? Be easier.
Yeah. And it's funny, like, and, you know, for folks that are listening to this in the future, we're recording this on May 9th of 2023. And so in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of chatter around microservices versus monoliths again, because of a blog post that was published by a large tech company. I'm not going to name it. Like, if folks want to figure it out, they could probably figure it out pretty easily. But basically, they decided to go from like a serverless microservice based approach to, I guess you can call it a monolith. It's really not a monolith, but that's the approach that I think a lot of people, that's what people are defining it as. And it's very interesting to me because I think it really just boils down to, like, if you use technology wrong, you're going to have a hard time, right? Like, it doesn't matter, like, the new hot serverless edge computing thing. Like, if you're building it wrong, it's going to be poor performance, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So you should probably course correct. And I kind of applaud, like, this company for doing that. But I also think that it's kind of hilarious that now the community, without kind of reading into all of the detail, are like, oh, we're back to monoliths again. It's always funny. Like, we're very reactionary in tech, and I think we're reactionary in society in general. But it's funny that in tech we go down this path of like, oh, you told me this wasn't the thing, but now you're doing the thing, so now I'm going to get very confused and angry at the same time about the thing.
Yeah, I agree. It does feel like if certain influential people or companies or whatever output a blog post, everyone goes, aha, so that's my solution to all of the problems I've been having with the previous thing you blog posted about 5 years ago. But it's horses for courses. Sorry, that's a phrase. You need to pick the right solution for your problem, and that will be different. That will be different, but like you said, it can be the wrong thing. And microservices can work. It's just a very different way of working. And I think monoliths can work if they stay small. It's all just different ways of working for different use cases.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, like our responsibility should be making maintenance of our stuff not challenging, right? Like if a monolith is the approach because you're working on the same code base and it makes sense to ship the entire thing at once, cool. Continue to do that. If like you don't want, like, to use like the canonical example, if you don't want to ship like the order tracking part of your e-commerce app with the cart part of your app, then they should probably be different microservices. And it seems to me like people want to make it more complicated than that. And it is fair that it is more complicated to that to an extent, but it's really about what makes your life better for a developer. Because at the end of the day, like, developers have enough nonsense they have to deal with, right? Like, there's too many tools, there's too many options for technology, there's too many opinions. So like, if we can just filter out all the noise and just focus on the developer experience, like, we end up coming out pretty good.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I think, like you say, the developer experience there, like focusing on that. What I was going to say is that it's easy when you're greenfielding this stuff to come up with the right solution. But yeah, once it becomes brownfield, which is probably like, I don't know, a year after it being released, you're then suddenly dealing with all of your decisions and wondering to yourself, why did I do this? And I think, like you said, it's reacting to the situation as it really is, and making it easier to work with based on the reality of what you're doing.
Yeah, and just for reference, like, one of our friends in chat literally just said, this is why we should listen to everyone, but do what you want and what suits you best at the time, right? And again, like, depending on what your problem is or your opportunity is, like, it could be very easy to make these changes or take these opinions and whatever. But for the most part, it's not, right? Like, especially when you're talking about, years of work, like tons of developers, right? So like, the idea of like legacy is very, very interesting to me, because legacy only occurs if you're not agile, right? And, it's only been like the last 20 years or so where like agile methodologies are like even a thing. Like 20 years is probably even saying like it's probably not even that long, like where it's actually been like fully adopted. Like, you're obviously one more versed in the agile space than I am, and you could probably give your opinion of this, but it is interesting that like we're always kind of trying to counteract the poor decisions we've made in our history, right? It is very, very, and I think that's part of the job, is like working through that struggle and trying to figure things out.
Definitely. You don't have all the answers either. You don't know exactly how it's going to be used 2 or 3 years' time. So you constantly need to be reacting. I actually quite prefer working on legacy, in quotes, systems, because they are the ones that are battle tested. They're the ones that have they keep the business afloat. They're usually the ones that are money making and the more interesting ones to try and to work on. You can make the biggest, I would say, impact working on a legacy system, improving the way it is, than bringing in something new and swish. I quite like finding those things that aren't quite working and making them easier to deploy, easier to monitor and get metrics around. People suddenly look at this old system they've been ignoring when you give it a little bit of care and attention, and they're like, whoa.
Yeah.
I didn't know it could do that. I'm like, well,
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that I haven't thought about a ton, about the idea of stability with legacy systems, right? Like, I mean, how many people are still building COBOL applications or Fortran applications, right? Like, that's an interesting thing to talk about. Like, at the end of the day, like, yeah, it's not shiny and it's not exciting, and as developers, we're natural tinkerers and we're curious, but like, if something's been around for 60 years, the chances of being replaced are pretty slim, right? Like, and I know that there's lots of efforts out there to take legacy applications that are like VB6 apps or even older than that and modernizing them. That's great. Yeah. But if it doesn't make sense for your business, then you're never going to do it. And if you try to do it, you're never going to do it well.
it won't be easy, but sometimes it's worth it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Uh, you've got to balance it because I don't imagine there's many security patches out for COBOL anymore, but I don't know really.
sure,
It's also probably
sure.
not hacked much anymore either. Uh, but if you've got like some old .NET applications, it's definitely worth upgrading
Yeah,
those purely for not getting caught up in some old school hack that's still, you
yeah,
know,
yeah. Like if you like, my favorite thing is if I haven't had the luxury of working in like .NET framework for a long time.
mm,
But when I did, I remember I would like search for questions and like I would always be just kind of, I don't know, disheartened is a word, but I always kind of like be sad if I would see something that like an answer somewhere that was like
yeah.
10 years old. And I'm like, oh no, like this problem has been solved for like 10 years. Like, and I
Yeah.
would kind of feel, I would kind of like just not be down, but I'd be like, oh, like this is what I'm doing now. But again, like there is something to say, like if you're building something fresh and new, it's exciting, but you run the risk of, again, making poor technology choices, it not doing what you want, like from a business standpoint. And then where are you left? Like, then you have like this thing that you have to maintain that probably won't get love anymore because it doesn't make a lot of money or whatever. And, like how exciting is that? Like eventually everything becomes brownfield, right? Like,
Eventually.
yeah, like I don't know very many people, their sole job, if they're an engineer, is like greenfield work, right? Like they're always building like cutting edge stuff. Like eventually they have to maintain old stuff too.
Yes.
I don't know if you've had the luxury of only doing greenfield at some point in your career, but that also seems a bit exhausting because it's
Yeah.
so much like what's new in technology? Like what do I need to care about? Do I need Kubernetes? Like, um, it is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I actually have a soft spot for any kind of brownfield type things.
Yeah,
I really do. You put me on brand new Swish things, as it's not. So I've got too many questions that need to be answered. Like,
sure.
how do I get this? How do I get my metrics out of this? How do I monitor this? How do I, like, ensure that it's working well? How do I know it's working poorly? But with something that has been around for a little bit longer, you've got, like, say, customer impact, and the challenges then are changing it in a way that nobody knows it's being changed, and I
Yeah.
like that. I like the idea that I've made this better, haha, but you didn't see it happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of moves into like this next area that I would love to talk about with you about like the community side of tech, right? Like, for folks that might not know, Chris is an avid member in the developer community. She speaks at conferences. She helps run conferences. She does all sorts of amazing things. And one thing that I've, seen in my time as somebody who is similar, like going out and speaking in the developer community, is that everybody wants to learn the new thing,
Yeah.
but they're still working on the old thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that there's interesting conversations to be have of like bridging that gap in content, right? Like how do you go from here to here, right? And I think, as somebody who has seen a lot of talks, seen a lot of community interaction, like, what sort of content from your perspective like resonates with folks? Is it like, hey, new shiny thing, everybody get excited about it? Or is it like, hey, how can you like do your job better?
It's like I say, I've worked on select talk committees, selection committees, and I've seen which ones end up being good and which ones end up having less of a crowd than others, and it's a mix. I would say that
Hmm.
the shiny ones definitely fill the room
Yeah.
because, like you said, everyone wants to know. Everyone wants to know more about the next version of C Sharp, and they'll happily sit through a talk by like Scott Hanselman or something because they just want that shiny, and
Hmm.
they're not gonna get to use it anytime soon because they're working on a legacy banking system that's still in C Sharp 3 or something, and but the problem with putting on the talks of the kind of more transitiony legacy things is you've got to do it at the right time where everybody's making that change. Otherwise, you're dealing with a small subset of a small subset of people. So you've got the people that are in tech, down into the people that are at your conference, down to the people that are also using your technology, moving to the new technology. And you end up with a small room of very dedicated, interested people. So you'll find that they have less chance of getting picked at a conference that's big, and they're probably more well approached at like a meetup group or something like that, because the people in that room um, are a small number of the full number of people that could be there. So they do have an audience, but it's more likely if you put those two talks next to each other, one in one room over here and one in a room over there, one of those rooms will be empty.
Yeah, and that's always that's an interesting point. Like I think, as a speaker, like the most debilitating, sad feeling is like people aren't in your room, right? I try to take a positive out of that as much as I can, but it still hurts, right?
Yeah.
So if it's a smaller group of folks, like I try to have it be more conversational, because like I feel very strange if there's like a room of like 5 people or less, and I'm talking to a room of hundreds, right? So I try to turn it into more of a conversation, because I think that that's giving like a +1 experience to those folks that are sitting in my room, right? Like they didn't expect to like actually like have a conversation. They expect to watch a session, and maybe they just wanted to watch a session. But most folks, when I talk to, like, I've gotten more as a speaker out of like talking to rooms of 4 or 5 than I have of rooms of like 100 or 200. Like it's very strange how that works, because I think, and maybe this is kind of, it adds together like the virtual versus in-person speaking as well. Like if you're just speaking after a certain amount of time, like you're just speaking to a camera or to a spotlight or whatever, and you lose a lot of that connective tissue with the audience.
Yeah. I think I did try during the pandemic. I did try a couple of talks online, but I was basically staring at my slides the entire time, and that was I can't think of a nice, kind word, but it was very lonely. It did not feel. I didn't get that I'm doing a conference talk feeling, where you have the feedback from an audience member. And so if you get a nice small group like that, it can almost feel like an open space that you're leading, kind of a chat, a talk, rather than a presentation. But the problem, unfortunately, is that if you're selling tickets, you have to make them very expensive.
And that's always the problem, right? Like at the end of the day, like you can either be an organizer that is looking to break even, or you're an organizer looking to make money. And if you're an organizer looking to make money, like there is this very careful balance, because you don't want like people to like, spend $4,000 or a couple £1,000 on something, and then they have a bad experience, or they're like, oh, I could have watched a bunch of YouTube videos. And like I talk about this a lot with other speakers. It's like, especially now, because everybody has a YouTube channel. All of these conferences usually post their videos to YouTube afterwards for monetization and all that sort of stuff. Like, what's the real value in going to a conference? And as a speaker, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like we get to connect with the community, we get to see our friends, we get to do a little bit of traveling if we have the ability to travel, whatever, right? But if you're an attendee, like what's in it for you coming to a conference?
I think not, despite there being all those YouTube videos, like you say, out there, not everybody, despite their best intentions, will sit and watch them. At least that's me. I'm talking about myself, and I'm projecting. I know I can go on there and find a talk about pretty much anything by anybody, and I will put it there on my virtual bookshelf, and I will watch that talk later. Except I won't. Shelf, like all those other unread books. What I think I like about a conference is dedicated time I'm putting together to my learning. I'm saying for these 2 or 3 days, I am going to learn. I'm going to see these talks, and by being in person, being in that atmosphere, being surrounded by other people just as interested, it's for the experience of it. You end up eventually, if you're feeling that way, becoming part of the community too. But even if you don't, it's that dedicated time that you've put aside to do that learning, without taking it away from, say, your evenings or your weekends.
It is like, and I come at it from a different approach, right? Like I do agree with you that like, I can bookmark or save this video, but I'll never watch it. I totally see that, right? Especially like most of us, a fair amount of us have the opportunity to work from home or work from home part-time. And like, do I want to watch YouTube videos at the same time that I'm trying to get work done, or do it after work? Like my boss is definitely not going to like, oh, what are you doing today? Oh, I'm going to watch a couple of conference talks. Like that's not going to work. But for like, I see it from an attendee's perspective. Like if you go to a conference today and you're not trying to build some sort of connective tissue with the other folks that are there, whether they be attendees, speakers, organizers, you're missing out, right?
Yeah.
Because like, I think at one point in time, and this is obviously before the pandemic, like, you know, you would go to like a big tech conference and you would go to the sessions and then you would go back to your hotel room or whatever, right? And, or maybe you'd go walk around and get some swag, right? I think now it is almost like the sessions, and this is not the best way to phrase this, but the sessions are kind of like the not most important thing, right?
Yeah.
And I know as a conference organizer, like that's a scary thing because like, oh, what's the point of me having these things, right?
I would say it's not a scary thing. If you've got any, in some of the conferences I'm involved in, we do have some control over the schedule itself. And in one of the conferences I'm working with, we do leave like a 20-minute gap between some of our sessions because we know and want to encourage what we all call the hallway track.
Yep.
And in those 20-minute sessions, they'll have an option to see like a lightning talk or something. But if not, have that hallway track, go and meet people, go talk to people. Yeah, I know it's not scary not to have people that, in a session. We want.
Yeah, and I mean, especially now more than ever, because we've spent kind of like the last 3 years and change, like looking at screens all day, right? I mean, not to say that everybody is more comfortable, not everybody's comfortable in going back out and doing these things, but I think that to an extent, in a lot of places around the world, you know, if you are safe and you're prepared, like your risks are lower, right? But I agree that I respect the fact that some people will never feel comfortable again, and that's fine. Yeah. But if you do feel comfortable and you want to go to a conference, I think one thing that organizers have done that I've seen that's kind of cool is like different color lanyards. Like that's something that I saw that's like, okay, like what are you comfortable with? Like, are you comfortable with a handshake? Are you comfortable with a fist bump? Are you comfortable with a hug? Like these sort of things are really like, this is how the community and conferences grow to adapt to the new surroundings. And I think one thing that you said about adding buffer time between talks is really cool. Usually what ends up happening though is that just means sessions are shorter, which is somewhat challenging for speakers sometimes. Some speakers, like, they feel like they need to take their 60-minute talk and now it's 40 minutes, so it's just rushed the whole time. I'm guilty of that sometimes too. Not to say that I'm more evolved in that regard, but I think that there is something to say about like less content, more community at some of these events.
Yeah, I do think it's a great idea to emphasize that in all of our events for sure. I think it's one of the biggest pulls for me is community. And like I say, I do like all those efforts that the conference organizers are doing with different incorporating people's comfort levels and making it clear. When we did Agile on the Beach conference in the UK last year, we had an outdoor space, which was like we had all the doors open towards the outdoor space, so it meant that people could freely leave a talk and go outside if they felt like uncomfortable being indoors for a very long time. I mean, masks were encouraged, but you could, like I say, we were letting as much free air in as we could, and just trying to make people feel a little less trying to help as much as we can.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is just another thing that we have to all be mindful of, right? Like, I'm very guilty of assuming that everybody has the same comfort level as me. And I'm a pretty comfortable person. Like, I don't mind, handshake or hug or whatever. Like, I've gotten COVID twice. I'm like, I'm gonna get it again. Like, it is what it is, right? And that's probably not the best way to think about things. But I need to understand, I need to respect the fact that not everybody is at the same comfort level as me. And I think what's super interesting, especially as we talk about like conferences are a large part of it, but there's also like code camps and meetups, which are even like on a smaller scale. And I don't know if you've had much experience post-COVID in those sort of communities, but like it's really painful. Like not there, like you can't get a lot of groundswell around like very small community gatherings, which is very interesting to me. Like, there's a lot of reasonings why, but like, I'd love to kind of, if you have any thoughts, like, how can we build that back up? Because I think that's something that's greatly important, but it's definitely missing now in this world that we live in.
I will admit that I haven't been to tech meetups since. I've only been to conferences, but since like the world opened again, I haven't been to meetups. I would say one of the biggest reasons is because I'm working from home.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking about myself here and extrapolating to everyone else, but meetups were great when I was already in the center of the city and they started at 6 and I just wandered from the office to the meetup and then have the meetup and then go home. But if I had to leave my home, going to the center of
Yeah.
town and then go back, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that's kind of stopping meetups from coming, quote unquote, coming back, right? Like, we might not be in the same place physically where we were 3 years ago. We might have moved. Like, we could move way farther away from town. We definitely don't go into the office as much. At least a lot of folks in tech don't. But I think in general too, like, and also like a lot of organizers for meetups like have lost space. Like, they no longer have a space to get sponsored, which is a problem. And I think, like, especially in that world, like, virtual is very, very hard. Like, for very, very small groups, right? Like, and it's interesting. I'd love to get your thoughts too. Like, how can we do better in that regard, like with the virtual experience for people that want to network and communicate and collaborate and be a part of a community? And I mean, I'm not asking you, Chris, to solve all the problem or to have a solution for the problem, but I'd love to get your thoughts as like, because I think it's fair to say, like, virtual events, like, right now, it's not the best, right?
No, they're not. And I currently work for a company that is virtual 100%. And it is tough to get right. You get more than a certain amount of people. You're basically just all of you watching this one person talking. You're back to a presentation style. It's not really a community at that point. You can't chat within yourselves. I know there are apps like Hopin and stuff that are supposed to help with that, but I've not tried them, so I don't know what they're like. But I'm not a big fan of virtual meetups and stuff. I feel like there's still me sitting in a room on my own.
Yeah.
I I don't know how to improve it. I mean, I used to play, I'm trying to think what else it would parallel with, and I'm going back to games, and I'm thinking I used to play World of Warcraft. Sorry, I outed myself as a nerd there. I used to play World of Warcraft a lot, and somehow that enabled me to create community with people that I never met in person, but only met online. But how could I get that from an online community? I'm not sure. Like a meetup, maybe we all need to fight dragons. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting way to phrase it. No, I mean, and again, we can kind of move off the topic because I don't think either of us have like a great solution.
No.
But it is interesting. But it is interesting to think about, like, we do have to, I guess you could say, fight the dragon. Call out the elephant to the room. Like, it is hard to be a part of a community when, look, you're like, it's amazing that I can talk to you. You're in the UK. I'm on the West Coast of the US. Like, we're having a conversation where, people are watching live. Like, this is cool. But like, wouldn't it be much better if we were all in the same room? Right.
Yeah.
In a lot of regards. So, as we transition away from the sad conversation of staring at screens for 10 hours a day, I'd love to kind of hear, like, some of the stuff that you're working on now. Like, I know that, based on, your LinkedIn, that now you're an engineer at Stack Overflow. Like, what are some of the things that, that are really exciting? And you don't need to talk about things that you're building internally or anything like that, obviously. But like, what are some of the things that you see that Stack Overflow, problems that they're looking to solve, as more and more people like are completely dependent on knowledge bases online?
One of the things that Stack Overflow really like tries to do well at, and I know they haven't always done well at, is the community aspect. I know that they've the hard way. I've only been there about 6 months, and I'm still learning about it because it's a 15-year-old company. There's a bit of legacy in there, which is lovely and tasty for me. But community is definitely a big thing for them. They have they do think it's one of those that makes them different from any other knowledge base system. They're not just giving you like Coursera or things like that, where they just give you presentations and slides. It's more people helping people. And so what was the rest of your question?
No, I mean, and we can kind of stop there. And we can kind of have a conversation lightly around. It's funny that you say that, like, you know, I would, at least from my outside opinion, I would think Stack Overflow is very much a community-based company. Tech just happens to be like the delivery mechanism for it, right? Like, I've even heard people compare it. It is kind of like a social network for developers, right? I mean, you know, there are celebrities on Stack Overflow. Like, everybody knows who John Skeet is, right? Like, every single person, like every developer knows who he is, not just because he's an amazing developer, which he is, but also because he's very prolific in his answering on Stack Overflow. And it is interesting for you to say, like, that, you know, there are tons of opportunities still to do better as a community platform, right? We're learning for sure. And it's funny to me with Stack Overflow because, you know, I don't know if this is true or not. It seems to me like it's like the most, at least in developer circles, .NET developer circles, it's like the most famous .NET app, right? or like, and I think, you know, it is funny to say, like, you know, obviously there are there's probably bigger applications out there than Stack Overflow, right, that are written in .NET. But it is something to say that it's like the most famous. And I don't know if that's because of, you know, the fact that there was a lot of work done to kind of demystify the architecture around it and all that, you know, that's been done in the past. But I mean, from your perspective, like, you've gotten your hands dirty in a lot of different technologies, right? Like, you know, what is it about .NET that makes Stack Overflow run so well? Like, obviously people can read blog posts by folks, but like, it is interesting to see like that technology decision.
I wasn't there when that decision was made, as you know, so I can't really explain it to detail. But I do know that there was a culture, and it's still there, a culture of writing performant code. So I think that no matter what language was chosen, I reckon that culture is what drove them rather than the .NET. I mean, C# has grown in the 15 years they've worked on it. It's definitely changed. It's on .NET Core now, Stack Overflow. So we've had to they've had to bring it along with the frameworks and not just leave it in the .NET. Like 1.1, it probably was written in 15 years ago. So the code bit is, I would say, an aside. It was the culture internally on getting a very performant application, for sure.
Yeah, I just love it, the fact that, like, if anybody ever asks me, like, oh, like, what has been cool that's been built in .NET, and I'm like, Stack Overflow, and that's it's kind of like mic drop, right? And you know, and that's, you know, as we kind of wrap up the conversation, Chris, I want to thank you so much for hopping on and chatting with me. And it's late in your day, you know. As I wrap up, I'd love to ask my guests, and this is the only other question that I stage, and sometimes it's challenging for folks, so I apologize. If you could, you know, think of all the things we've talked about today, tech, community around it, all those sort of things, but you only had one word to describe that feeling when you think of tech and community, what word would that be? And you can cheat. You can use two words if you want.
No,
I'm
going to use the word you used, actually, and that is tinkering. I love it.
Very good. Oh my goodness. I've been doing this for a while. I don't think anybody's used tinkering, so that's great. I love it. That's awesome.
Only because of the context of today's chat, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, that's awesome. And with that, we're all done. So, Chris, I want to thank you so much for being on the show and chatting with me. If folks want to follow along with what Chris is doing these days, you can follow her on Twitter, Chris Ann Odell. Did you have any parting words for us before we sign off?
Parting words. Just I don't know. No, not really. The first thing that came to mind was Bill and Ted's be excellent to each other. But so good, so good. You know, we can have a whole show on Bill and Ted if you wanted to at some point.
Yeah. So excellent. So thank you everybody for tuning in and listening in the future. This has been awesome. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and I hope to see you next time. So I'm Isaac Levin for my friend Chris. Thank you so much for listening to Coffee and Open Source. Take care.